Every night at 9 o'clock, my phone would ring from a number I never once saved to my contacts. Not in 4 years. Not even after everything I'm about to tell you. I used to tell myself I hadn't saved it because I didn't need to. I knew those 10 digits the way you know your own front door in the dark. That was true. It was also not the reason, and it took me a long time to admit what the real reason was. The call always came at 9, never 9:01, and it always ended, without fail, before it could become anything other than what we'd agreed. Without ever discussing it, it was allowed to be. I should start with how it began, because the order matters. If I tell you the middle first, you'll think this is a story about two people falling in love against their better judgment. It isn't, or at least it isn't only that. It's a story about a phone call kept small on purpose, for 4 years, by two people who understood exactly what would happen if either of us let it get any bigger, and chose, every single night, not to let it. My name is Renata Cole. I was 31 when this starts, 35 now, living in Cincinnati, working as a flight paramedic for a regional air ambulance service that covered a wide, ugly stretch of rural Ohio and Kentucky, where the nearest trauma center was sometimes 45 minutes away by road and 12 by helicopter. It's a strange profession to explain to people who haven't done it. You spend your working life in the 11 minutes between someone's worst moment and the hospital doors, strapped into a bucket seat in a Bell 407, doing everything you can with what fits in 2 duffel bags, while the rotor noise makes conversation with your own crew a matter of shouting into a headset mic 4 inches from your mouth. The man this story is about was my flight communications specialist, the person on the ground, in the base, who took the call from dispatch, worked the radio, coordinated with hospitals, and talked our pilot and me through weather and routing when things got difficult in the air. His name was Daniel Ruiz. He was 41 when I started at that base, 10 years my senior, and, this is the part I want to say plainly, the way the story deserves, right at the start, he had been engaged, for the entire time I knew him, to a woman named Sophia, a schoolteacher he'd been with since before I ever set foot in that hangar. That gap wasn't small, and it wasn't hidden. Everyone at the base knew Daniel was getting married eventually, in the vague way people talk about a wedding that keeps getting pushed a year at a time for reasons nobody outside the relationship ever really gets to know. I knew it from my first week. He never once let me forget it, and to his credit, he never tried to. The specific boundary in this story isn't a work rank boundary, the way it sometimes is in stories like this. Daniel wasn't my supervisor. We were peers, technically, both reporting up to the same base manager, and there was no rule on any HR document that would have made anything between us a violation of policy. The boundary was entirely his, built out of a commitment he'd made to another woman years before I arrived, and the not crossing of it was never about risk to either of our jobs. It was about what kind of man he'd decided to be, long before I was ever part of the equation, and it turned out to be a decision sturdier than almost anything I've encountered since. The call itself started in a way so small I didn't register it as the start of anything at all. In my first month at the base, I flew a call that went badly. A 2-year-old, a rural pond, the kind of call that follows you home and sits on your chest for days afterward, no matter how many times you've done this work. I didn't sleep that night. Around 9, my phone rang, an unfamiliar local number, and when I picked up, it was Daniel. His voice low and steady over what I later learned was him sitting alone in his truck in the base parking lot, not ready to drive home yet either. "You handled that well today," he said. I don't say that to be nice. I say it because it's true. And because I know you're probably lying awake right now telling yourself something else. We talked for maybe 20 minutes. Nothing dramatic, he asked about the call, listened more than he talked, told me, when I asked, about the first hard call he'd ever worked the radio for, years before I arrived. A car fire on I-75 that still visited him some nights even now. Then, at 9:20, he said he should let me sleep, and hung up, and I lay there afterward turning the strangeness of it over, that a colleague I'd known 4 weeks had called, just to make sure a bad night didn't turn into a bad week. He called again the next night, and the next. By the end of that first month it had become, without either of us naming it, a fixture. 9 o'clock, most nights. Sometimes just a few minutes, sometimes 20. Always ending cleanly. Always him who initiated the goodbye. I want to plant 3 things here, because they'll matter enormously later, and I'd rather you see them arriving than have me spring them on you the way life sprang them on me. The first is the exact time. 9 o'clock, never earlier, never much later. A fixed point I eventually realized he must have built his whole evening schedule around without ever telling me so. The second is a phrase he used often, in different forms. Whenever I tried to thank him for something small he'd done at the base, swapping a shift, covering for me on a scheduling conflict, walking me through a difficult protocol change. That's just the radio doing its job. He said it like a joke, self-deprecating, brushing off credit, and I laughed every time without understanding, for years, that it was doing more work than a joke usually does. The third is smaller, and I almost missed it entirely. Daniel kept his phone, at all times, face down on any surface he set it on. The counter in the break room. The console in his truck. The desk at the base, a habit so consistent that another dispatcher joked about it once, calling it superstition. He said it was just a habit from an ex who used to read his texts. I believed that for a long time. I want you to notice that I believed it, the way I believed the reason for the ring on the chain in another story like this one. Because belief did a great deal of work here, that the truth eventually had to quietly undo. Sophia I met properly only twice in 4 years, which itself tells you something about how compartmentalized Daniel kept the different rooms of his life. The first time was at a base holiday party in my 2nd year, where she arrived late, having come straight from a parent-teacher conference night at the elementary school where she taught 2nd grade. Still wearing a cardigan with a crayon smudge on one sleeve that she laughed about when she caught me looking. She was warm, unguarded, entirely unsuspicious of me in a way that I found, at the time, both a relief and something close to shame. She shook my hand and said, "So you're the one who flies with him. He talks about the crew a lot. You, especially, always says you've got the steadiest hands he's ever worked with." I remember that sentence landing somewhere in my chest I didn't yet have a name for. Talks about you especially. I filed it away, the way I filed away most things in those years, and went back to my drink. The base itself deserves some describing, because the setting shaped everything about how this unfolded. It was a converted agricultural hangar at the edge of a regional airport, 40 minutes outside the city proper, shared by our aircraft, a small fleet of crop dusters that used the far end of the runway, and an aviation mechanic's shop that kept strange hours of its own. Our crew worked 24-hour shifts, 3 days on, 4 off, which meant that, for 3 consecutive days at a stretch, Daniel and I effectively lived in the same building, him at the radio desk in the small windowed room off the main hangar floor that everyone called the box. Me, either in the crew quarters catching sleep between calls or strapped into the aircraft responding to one. The specific ritual the title refers to, the 9 o'clock call, only happened on my off nights. The 4 days between rotations when I was home in my apartment across town, and he was, presumably, at his own place with Sophia, or on the nights she had late grading to do, alone with whatever version of himself existed outside the base. He never once called during my on-shift days. I understood, without either of us saying it, that this was deliberate, that whatever this was, it lived exclusively in the space between our working lives, never inside them, never touching the actual job we shared. I want to describe a handful of those early calls properly, because they were the real foundation of everything, brick by brick, long before either of us admitted there was a structure being built at all. There was a night in my 3rd month, March, unseasonably cold. Ice on the power lines outside my apartment window, when the call came at 9 as always, but he didn't lead with anything about work. "Tell me something that has nothing to do with medicine," he said. "I've had 4 hours of radio traffic about a school bus accident that turned out fine, and I need to think about something else for 20 minutes before I can sleep." I told him about the greenhouse my grandmother used to keep behind her house in Kentucky, the smell of the tomato plants in July, the way she used to let me eat them straight off the vine, still warm from the sun, salt from a shaker she kept in her apron pocket for exactly that purpose. He listened in a way I wasn't used to being listened to, not waiting for his turn to talk, not offering advice, just present in the quiet on the other end of the line in a way that made the 20 minutes feel like the calmest 20 minutes of my week. When I finished, he said, "I think that's the nicest thing anyone's told me all year." And I lay awake afterward turning the sentence over, embarrassed at how much it had meant to me. A compliment about tomatoes from a man I'd known 3 months. By month 6, the calls had a shape to them that neither of us had designed, but both of us clearly maintained. He always asked about my on-shift days first, not generic pleasantries, but specific follow-up on specific calls, remembering details from nights before that I'd mentioned only once, in passing, over the radio or in the crew quarters. He remembered the name of the 2-year-old from that first bad call, Mason, and asked, months later, out of nowhere, whether I'd ever found out if the boy pulled through fully. I hadn't thought to follow up myself. The not knowing had just become one more piece of unprocessed grief I carried without examining. Daniel had apparently called the receiving hospital himself, off the clock, using contacts from his years working communications, just to find out, and told me, quietly, that Mason had made a full recovery and was back in kindergarten that fall. I didn't ask him why he'd gone to that trouble. I just felt, for days afterward, something loosen in my chest that I hadn't known was still tight. There was a woman at the base, an empt named Carla, who worked ground transport rather than flight, and so crossed paths with both of us often enough to notice things neither of us said aloud. In my 2nd year, she caught me smiling at my phone in the crew break room at 9:15 on an off night I'd come in early for equipment check, and she said, not unkindly, "Is that Ruiz? You get this look whenever it's him." "It's just Daniel checking in," I said too quickly, the way you talk when you've just been caught at something. "Renata," Carla said, setting down the clipboard she was holding, "I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying, I've been doing this job 11 years, and I know what a work friendship looks like. And I know what this looks like, and they're not the same thing to look at, whatever they might be underneath." She didn't push further. That was, I think, the first time someone had named, even obliquely, that whatever this was had a witness. That it wasn't happening in some sealed private world only Daniel and I occupied, but out in the open, visible to anyone paying close enough attention, even if there was never anything concrete enough to actually confront either of us about. I never told her she was wrong. I also never told her she was right. I said something about how Daniel checked in on everyone after hard calls, which was true, technically, in the sense that he was conscientious about crew welfare in a way that extended beyond just me, but I knew, even as I said it, that no one else on that crew got a call at 9 o'clock every single night, rain or shine, on or off-duty schedule, for years running. Carla knew it too. She let it go. the way people mostly did, because there was never anything you could point to and call evidence. My mother asked me about him too, in my second year, on one of my rare weekends home. "Who's Daniel?" she said, out of nowhere over dinner. "You mentioned him 3 times in an hour. He's the comm specialist at my base," I said. "We work together closely. He calls to check in sometimes." I said it in the same flat, closing tone I'd use for years afterward, whenever anyone asked, "Carla," my mother. Eventually my own sister, a sentence engineered to end a conversation rather than open one. My mother, like everyone else, let it drop. There was never anything in the sentence itself to push against. In my own private accounting, across those first 2 years, I built a handful of competing theories about what this actually was. And I want to be honest that I was never fully sure which one was true. And I'm still not, even now, even after everything I eventually learned. Some nights I decided it was simple loneliness on his part. A man in a long, drifting engagement, working strange hours in an isolated hangar, finding easy company in a colleague who happened to share his schedule and his temperament, nothing that would survive being said aloud in daylight. Other nights, lying awake after the calls ended, I decided it was something closer to what I felt myself, a current running steady and quiet beneath 4 years of 9 o'clock phone calls, which both of us were choosing, night after night, not to examine too closely, for fear of what examining it might cost either of us. I kept a small paper notebook then, mostly flight logs and personal notes I never meant for anyone else to read, and in it, sometime in year 2, I wrote, "I don't think he's decided what this is either. I think we're both just very good at ending the call before it has to become one thing or the other." The obstacle, when I finally let myself see it plainly, was never something Daniel hid from me. He told me himself, in the spring of my 3rd year, on a night that started ordinarily enough and ended with both of us saying more than either of us usually allowed. We were on a slow overnight shift, no calls yet, sitting in the box together at nearly 2 in the morning, an unusual overlap since our regular hours rarely put us in the same physical room this late, but a scheduling swap had put us both on duty. The hangar was quiet except for the hum of the space heater and the occasional radio chatter from ground dispatch. I asked him, finally, after nearly 3 years of never asking, why the wedding kept getting pushed back. Sophia and Daniel had now been engaged, by my count, for going on 6 years total, longer than most actual marriages I knew. He was quiet for a while before he answered, turning a coffee mug slowly on the desk in front of him. "Sophia's dad had a stroke 2 years ago," he said. "Bad one. Her mom can't manage the house alone, and Sophia's the only one of 3 kids who lives close enough to help. Every time we set a date, something happens, a hospitalization, a fall, a bad scan, and we push it again. Because neither of us can stomach planning a wedding while her father's in and out of the ICU." He looked up at me. "It's not about whether I want to marry her. I do. It's about what kind of man asks a woman to choose between her father and a wedding date, when I can just wait. Waiting costs me nothing that matters." Then, he said something I've turned over more times than almost any other sentence in this story. "I'm telling you this because I think you've earned knowing why nothing here." He gestured, faintly, at the space between us. The desk, the 2 coffee mugs, 4 years of 9 o'clock calls compressed into one small motion of his hand, is ever going to become anything more than it already is. Not because I don't, and he stopped there, the sentence unfinished, and I never asked him to finish it, and he never offered to. I want to be fair to him in the telling of this, because I've examined this scene more than any other single moment in 4 years, and I still don't believe it was an excuse built to keep 2 options open. Sophia's father did have a stroke. He did decline slowly over the following 2 years, and I met him once, briefly, at a base picnic Daniel invited a few of us to. A thin, silent man in a wheelchair who watched the softball game without speaking. And Daniel wheeled him into the shade himself, without being asked, without making it a show of anything. That's not a man building himself cover. That's a man telling me, as plainly as he knew how, the actual, unglamorous shape of the commitment standing between us. The boundary was tested exactly once, that I know of, later that same year. It was after a hard call, a motorcycle accident, a rider we lost despite everything, the kind of call that leaves your hands unsteady for hours afterward. And Daniel had stayed at the base long after his shift ended, waiting for me to land and debrief, which wasn't required of him, and which he'd never done before. We ended up alone in the crew break room near midnight, both of us drained in the particular way this job drains you, sitting closer on the same worn couch than we usually allowed ourselves. Neither of us said anything for a long moment, 4, maybe 5 seconds, though it felt considerably longer, and I remember looking at him and thinking, with a clarity that frightened me, if I lean forward 6 inches right now, something happens that cannot be undone. I believe, though I've never been able to confirm it and never will, that he was thinking some version of the same thing, because his eyes moved to my mouth for exactly as long as it takes to notice such a thing, and then away, again, deliberately, the way you'd pull your hand back from a stove before it burns you, rather than after. He stood up first, said he should get home, that Sophia would be waiting up. It was nearly 1 a.m. I don't think Sophia was waiting up for anything. But he left, and I sat there alone in the break room a while longer, understanding that we had come as close to the edge as either of us ever intended to come, and that the not crossing of it, that night, had cost him something real to choose. Year 4 brought the change, though. As with most such things, I didn't recognize it as a turning point while it was happening. My grandmother, the one with the tomato greenhouse, took a bad fall that spring and needed someone nearby for the recovery, and I took a transfer to a flight base 2 hours south, closer to her, closer to the family I'd been increasingly needed by as she aged. Daniel and I said goodbye in the box, of all places, on an unremarkable Tuesday. A handshake, a "you'll do good work down there," a box of my personal effects from the crew quarters under my arm. I remember him saying at the very end, almost as an afterthought, "Keep the number the same if you get a new phone." Just in case. I said I would. I didn't examine, at the time, what just in case might have meant to a man who'd called that number at 9 o'clock nearly every night for 4 straight years. For the 18 months after that, the calls didn't stop entirely, but they thinned. Once a week, then every couple of weeks, then, eventually, mostly texts, brief and functional, checking in around holidays or after a bad call I'd mentioned on the base group chat. I told myself, during that period, that what we'd had was a close professional friendship that happened to feel, at certain specific hours, like more than that, and that the feeling had always been mine to manage and mine alone, since he had a fiancé and a father-in-law in decline and an entire life built 2 hours north of wherever I now was. I believed that account of things almost completely. I want to underline the word almost, because some part of me, even then, must have suspected there was more beneath the surface of those 4 years than the surface itself had ever shown me, or the discovery that came later would not have undone me quite as thoroughly as it eventually did. It was 14 months after my move south, on an ordinary Wednesday evening, that Carla called me. I hadn't spoken to her directly in almost a year. We'd exchanged the occasional text, the way people do when a shared chapter of life has quietly closed without either party wanting to say so outright, and when her name came up on my phone, my first thought, absurd and immediate, was that something had happened to Daniel. It hadn't. Not exactly. Not in the way I feared. But what she told me instead rearranged 4 years of memory inside about 6 minutes, and I don't think I've ever fully finished doing the rearranging, even now, even telling you this. I need to tell you something, Carla said, and I've been going back and forth for weeks about whether it's mine to tell. But I think you'd want to know, and I think if I don't say it now, I never will. She told me she'd been helping the base office manager clear out an old filing cabinet during a renovation. Files going back a decade. Mostly nothing. Insurance forms and old shift logs, but tucked in a folder marked with nothing but a date range spanning my first 4 years at the base. She'd found something that had nothing to do with base business at all. Records from a private aviation industry hardship fund, the kind flight crews sometimes pay into informally, off the books, to help a colleague through a financial gap that insurance or workers' comp doesn't cover. A fund. Carla explained that Daniel had apparently set up and personally administered, quietly, for years, without it ever being an official base program. There's an entry every month for 4 years, Carla said, routed to cover the difference on your grandmother's home health aid. Recurring, the same amount, same account, going back to the month after your grandmother's first fall, the one that happened while you were still up here. I sat down on my kitchen floor. I remember that specifically, not a chair. The floor. My back against the cabinet under the sink. Because my legs had simply stopped being willing to hold me up. My grandmother's home health aide, the one who'd made it possible for her to stay in her own house instead of a facility. The one whose cost I'd quietly absorbed for years by picking up nearly every overtime shift my new base offered, telling no one, certainly never telling Daniel, because I'd been too proud and too aware of exactly where the line between us sat to ever ask him for anything at all. That gap, the one I thought only I knew existed, had been partially covered, every single month, by a fund he'd built and fed himself, under a name generic enough that no auditor would ever have traced it back to a single flight paramedic in a hangar 2 hours south. He came to me before he set it up, Carla said. Asked if I'd help him keep the paperwork separate from anything official. Somewhere it couldn't get tangled up in a conflict of interest question if anyone at corporate ever went digging. A comm specialist quietly funding a former crewmate's family expenses would raise exactly the kind of questions neither of you needed. I told him it was a strange thing to ask of me. He said. Carla paused, and I could hear her deciding whether to say the next part. He said he didn't have anyone else he trusted with it, who also cared enough about you to make sure it got done right, without either of us ever having to tell you. I asked her, once I could speak again, how long she'd known. Since the 2nd year, she said. I've sat on it a long time, Renata, longer than I probably should have, but it was never really mine to tell, and I kept telling myself that was reason enough to stay quiet. She told me she was calling now partly because the renovation had forced the paperwork into the open regardless, and she'd rather I hear it from her, with context. Then stumble across a stray reference to it from someone at corporate who had no idea what it actually meant. I sat on that kitchen floor for a long time after we hung up, doing arithmetic in my head I hadn't known I needed to do. This payment landing the same month the aid's hours increased. That one landing right after my grandmother's second fall, each one arriving almost exactly when I'd been most quietly frightened about money and said nothing to anyone at all. And I understood, all at once, sitting there on the cold tile, that the 9 o'clock calls, the tomato plant conversation, that's just the radio doing its job. The phone always face down on every surface. None of it had ever been the edges of the story. It had been the visible outline of something enormous he'd built quietly underneath all of it, for years without once telling me, without ever once asking for anything back. I called him 3 days later. I needed those 3 days just to figure out what I was going to say, and even then I'm not sure I managed it. His voice on the phone sounded exactly the same as it always had at 9 o'clock. Low and even, though it had been over a year since I'd actually heard it rather than read it in a text. There was a long pause after I told him I knew. "Carla wasn't supposed to tell you that," he said finally, and there was something almost like relief threaded under the words. The tone, I think now, of a man being let out of a room he'd built for himself and locked carefully from the inside. "She thought I deserved to decide what to do with it," I said, "rather than have the decision made for me by a filing cabinet during a renovation. I think she was right to think that. We agreed to meet. Not at the base, neither of us suggested it, and I think we both understood without saying so that the box, the hangar, the crew break room, all belonged to a version of this that had already ended. Instead, we met at a diner off the interstate, roughly halfway between his town and mine, a place with truck stop coffee and a jukebox nobody had used in years. I got there first and watched him come in through the glass door, and it struck me, in the particular way it strikes you when you haven't seen someone in over a year, how much and how little he'd changed. A little more gray at his temples, the same way of clearing his throat before something difficult, the same habit. I noticed the moment he sat down, of setting his phone face down on the table without seeming to think about it at all. "I want to say this as plainly as I know how," he said, once the coffee had come and neither of us had touched it, "because I think we've spent 4 years, maybe more, not saying things plainly, and I don't want to keep doing that now that it doesn't matter in the same way anymore." "Doesn't matter in what way?" I asked. "You already know," he said, and there was no evasion in it, just a kind of tiredness. The tiredness of a man setting down something heavy he's carried a long way. "I did it because I couldn't stand the idea of you white-knuckling that gap alone every month while sitting across from me at 9 o'clock every night pretending your week had been fine. That's the whole reason, Renata. I didn't do it hoping for anything back. I need you to hear that part, because I think it's the part you're least likely to believe, and it's the part that actually matters." "I believe it," I said, and found, turning it over, that I did. "What I don't understand is why you never let me thank you." 4 years, Daniel. You could have told me at any point in 4 years. He was quiet a moment, turning his cup slowly without drinking from it. "Because the day I told you," he said, "is the day it stops being something I just did, quietly, because it was true, and starts being something I get credit for." I didn't want it to be that. I wanted it to just be true, whether you ever knew about it or not. He looked at me then, and there was nothing performing in his face, nothing angling toward a confession neither of us was ever going to make out loud. "I'm not telling you any of this to open a door. I'm telling you because Carla was right that you'd earned knowing. And because I'm 45 now, and Sophia's father passed 8 months ago, and something about losing him made me start thinking there's a real cost to letting the truest things in a life stay unsaid forever, even when saying them out loud changes nothing on the outside. I don't regret any of it. Not the fund, not the silence, not one night of those 4 years of phone calls. I'd do every part of it exactly the same way again." I asked him, because I had to, whether Sophia knew about the fund. "No," he said. "This is the one thing in my life I've kept from her completely, and I've made my peace with carrying that alone. The same way I made peace with everything else about those 4 years. The calls, the couch that one night, all of it. I'm not going to sit here and tell you nothing was ever there. You'd know I was lying, and I don't want to lie to you, not after all this. Something was there. I don't know exactly what to call it any more than you probably do. But I know what I chose to do with it, Every single time it came close enough to the surface to matter. And I know why, and I've never once regretted the choosing, not even on the nights it cost me something real to choose it. We sat in that diner for close to 2 hours, the coffee going cold twice, refilled twice, neither of us noticing, and there was no version of that afternoon where either of us reached across the table. No version where 4 years resolved into the kind of ending the shape of a story like this one might lead you to expect. I understood, somewhere in the second hour, that I didn't actually want that version. That what I'd wanted, without quite letting myself say so the whole time, was simply for the truth of those 4 years to exist somewhere outside my own head, confirmed once, plainly, by the one other person who'd actually lived inside them alongside me. That's a different thing than wanting him. I only came to understand the difference clearly once I'd finally had it. Before we left, I asked him about the face-down phone, the habit he'd always blamed on an old superstition from an ex who used to read his texts. He gave a small, tired laugh, the first real laugh I'd seen out of him that whole afternoon, and told me the truth. The fund's monthly transfer notifications came to that phone, and he'd kept it face down for 4 years so that no one, not Sophia, not a coworker glancing over his shoulder at the base, not even me, on the nights I sat near him in the box, would ever accidentally see a line of text that would have given the whole thing away before he was ready for it to be seen, if he was ever ready at all. It wasn't superstition, he said. It was just the only way I had to keep it quiet, without lying to anyone directly about what I was doing. I got very good at technically not lying over those years. I'm not proud of how good, honestly, I thought of Carla, watching us from the edges of the base for years, carrying the knowledge of the fund alone for most of that time, deciding on her own, again and again, when and whether to hand it to me. I thought of Sophia's father in his wheelchair at that long-ago picnic, and the 6 years of a delayed wedding that had never once, in 4 years, made Daniel's calls stop coming at 9 o'clock. And I thought of Mason, the 2-year-old from that very first bad call in my 3rd month, whose recovery Daniel had chased down off the clock just to be able to tell me, without my ever asking him to. We said goodbye in the diner's gravel parking lot under a flat gray Ohio sky, and there was no long embrace, nothing you'd have caught on film and called romantic. He shook my hand, an ordinary, professional handshake, the kind we'd exchanged 100 times over 4 years of shift changes, and said, "Take care of yourself, Cole," using my last name the way he had the very first week I knew him. And I understood it as its own kind of ending. Not a door closing on something that had never really been open, but a door finally being named. And then closed, with both of us agreeing, at last, on what it had actually been the whole time. I drove home that evening with the window cracked, and somewhere around the 2nd hour of the drive I found myself doing the thing I'm doing with you right now, turning the whole shape of it over in my hands, trying to decide what to call 4 years that had never been given a name while they were happening, and that I'm still not sure deserve one even now. I've come to believe, in the time since, that some of the truest things 2 people carry for each other were never built to resolve into a single word. Not friendship, not love, not devotion. Though I think a stranger hearing this for the first time might reasonably reach for any of those, and not be entirely wrong to. What Daniel gave me, I think, was simpler and somehow larger than any one of those words alone. He noticed exactly what I was too proud to say out loud, and instead of asking me to say it, he simply went and quietly made it true. I never saved his number, in all that time, and I never have since. I told myself for years it was because I already knew it by heart, which was true, but I understand now it was also because saving it would have made it into something official, a contact, a category, a decision about what he was to me And some part of both of us had built our whole 4 years specifically to avoid ever having to make that decision out loud. Even now, his name doesn't appear anywhere in my phone. When he calls, which is rare now, maybe 4 or 5 times a year, it still comes up as 10 unfamiliar digits, and something in my chest still does the same small thing it did the very first time, in my 3rd month, on the worst night of that first bad call. I don't know what I would have done on that midnight couch in the crew break room if he had leaned forward instead of standing up to say he should get home to a fiancé who probably wasn't waiting up. I've stopped trying to answer that question, because I think the answer matters less than the fact that he didn't, and that the not doing, sustained across 4 years, without either of us ever once naming it while it was happening, turned out to be its own complete and finished thing, not a story about what almost happened between 2 people, but a story about what one person quietly did for another, for years, and never once asked to be thanked for. I still fly. I transferred bases twice more since then, chasing better rotations, staying closer to my grandmother until she passed 2 years ago, peacefully, in the house she'd kept her whole life, in no small part because a man I never fully let myself have had made sure she could stay there. I think about that most on the nights I work a hard call now and come home to an apartment that's quiet at 9 o'clock. No phone ringing. No 10 unfamiliar digits lighting up the screen. I don't think that quiet is sad, exactly. I think it's just what's left when something finishes being what it was always going to be, without ever becoming anything else. That's the whole of it. Restraint isn't always the absence of a story. Sometimes it's the whole story, carried for years in the space between what was said and what was done, and told, in the end, in everything except the words that would have made it easy. If this story stayed with you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more quiet, honest stories.